We hear a lot about the Ten Commandments. We hear about, everybody ought to abide by the Ten Commandments. If you live by the Ten Commandments, you know you're all right. You don't kill, you don't steal, and so forth and so forth. How many people who talk about that know where the Ten Commandments are? How many of them know the background of the Ten Commandments and what the Ten Commandments really involve? So tonight and next Sunday night, I want to talk with you about the Ten Commandments. And tonight I want us to think in terms not only of the commandments themselves, which we'll talk a little bit about, but let's think about why these commandments were given and how they came about. What was the historical context of giving the Ten Commandments? Now maybe this will be new to some of you, I don't know. But the Ten Commandments are found in the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus. But the 19th chapter of the book of Exodus helps to lead us into the 20th chapter where the commandments themselves are found. However, if we're really going to understand the Ten Commandments, we've got to go back quite a bit further than that, all the way to the first chapter of the book of Exodus. The first chapter of Exodus opened basically with some of the slavery of the people and the birth of Moses. Well, very shortly following that, when Moses came back from Midian, he appeared before Pharaoh. And he said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." This was a message from God. And Pharaoh basically said, "No, they are our slaves." God said, "Pharaoh is an evil man." And before Moses ever appeared before Pharaoh, before Pharaoh ever rejected Moses, God said, "I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart." That's been very confusing to some people. Before he heard anything at all from Moses, God said, "I will harden his heart." Well, then he said a little bit later, "For this reason I have raised you up, that my power may be seen in you." And a lot of times people think, well, don't you see, that shows that God predestined Pharaoh to be destroyed. No, that's not what it says. He said, this is the reason I raised you to this prominent place. He was an evil man, and God was going to deliver his people, and he was going to show how evil this man really was. It's possible for a person to go to a point of no return. And Pharaoh had apparently come to this point. In the 2 Thessalonian letter in the 2nd chapter, Paul speaks of the fact that God will send people. Notice he didn't say the devil. He said God would send people a strong delusion that they may believe a lie and be condemned. Well, it's possible for people to go so far into sin, disregard God so long in their lives that the gospel no longer touches them. And that's what Paul was talking about in the 2 Thessalonian letter there and the 2nd chapter. Well, what does this have to do with the Ten Commandments? Just this. God wanted to show Pharaoh and wanted to show the Egyptian people that he was the only God. He doesn't have any competition. The people who are all around him, that is all around Pharaoh, worshiping the gods of the Egyptians, they saw that their gods, many of them, they thought that their gods controlled all kinds of things. They controlled the Nile River. They controlled the fertility of the soil. They controlled human reproduction. They controlled every part of man's existence. And a different God controlled different things. On the other hand, the Israelites had a God who was the only God. He was not just one more in the pantheon. He was the only God. And so through a series of plagues, God attacked all kinds of things that were sacred to the Egyptian people. For example, the Egyptian people thought of the Nile River as divine And they thought of God, the gods controlling the Nile River and giving Egypt its sustenance, because the Nile was such an asset to the country of Egypt. What was the first plague? Turning the water into blood. God showed that he had control over what actually was, in the minds of the Egyptians, the big source of their sustenance. And God controlled it. And then later, after that, another plague came that showed that God controlled the animal life or the marine life within the river. Frogs came up out of the river and infested the whole country. Those frogs didn't go away until God spoke. And you go through all the plagues, and the plagues are attacks against the gods of Egypt. And so you might say there's a contest going on here, and God wins every single time. And so the Israelites were shown that the God that heads their nation has no competition. He is the only God. Well, let's stop and look at those people for just a minute. For hundreds of years, the Israelites had been in Egypt. It's impossible, I think, for us to think that the Israelites were not influenced by these people. And so it's quite probable that the Israelites themselves were mixed up about their God and about the gods of the Egyptians and all. There's all kinds of possibilities here that I think we just overlook. And so, God delivered them. You remember the parting of the Red Sea and the death of the firstborn and all this sort of thing. And God delivered them out of Egyptian bondage and brought them to Mount Sinai. There were all kinds of things went on there at Mount Sinai, and God offered them a covenant. This covenant that he offered them was on the basis of what ordinary covenants were in those days. Now we have standard forms for contracts and leases and business agreements and things like this. We have some standard forms for agreements. You can go to a stationery store, for example, and you can buy one of these agreements. It's a covenant. It's a contract. Well, in the ancient world, they had similar things. All kinds of archaeological discoveries have shown that here are covenants that they made. We have bills of sale that came from the ancient people that have been discovered on little clay tablets. We have leases. We have business agreements. We have all kinds of things. Then in addition to that, we have covenants between nations. And, they had a form to them. And the covenant that God offered to Israel followed one of those forms. Let me read to you from the 19th chapter of the book of Exodus for just a minute. Okay, Israel has been delivered from the bondage. They've made their way down the Sinai Peninsula. The 19th chapter begins like this. In the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered into the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. They are there at Mount Sinai. Now what's going to happen? Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel." And here it is. "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me and fully keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession, although the whole world is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you are to speak to the Israelites. Now, everything else in this whole thing of the law of Moses comes back to this one little statement here. God says, I'm offering you a covenant. I'm offering you a covenant. Now, I have the right to do this. Not because I'm obligated to, but because of my love for you. So I'm going to choose you as a nation, but there's a stipulation here. You've got to keep my commandment. Okay, he goes on. So Moses, in verse 7, so Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and said before them the word of the Lord that the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together. Notice this. We will do everything that the Lord said. So Moses brought this answer back to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speak with you, and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. All right, now stop and think about this. If you saw the movie, The Ten Commandments, you saw a misrepresentation of something. Yes, Moses received the Ten Commandments directly from the Lord, but before that, the Lord had already spoken the Ten Commandments to the people. People don't stop to realize that. But the first thing was, God spoke the Ten Commandments to them. We'll drop on down to the 24th verse of chapter 19. The Lord replied, the 23rd verse. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy. And the Lord replied, go down, bring Aaron up with you, but the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them. So Moses went down and told the people. And then God spoke these words. So you see, the people are gathered together at the foot of Mount Sinai. They had said previously, I didn't read this part, but they had said previously, Moses, you speak to God. We're afraid to speak to God and have God speak directly to us. And so this is what they did. And so then the Lord spoke to them. And the first commandment was, the first statement rather was a preamble here. Let me mention to you the form of these, one of these Old Testament covenants. There are bilateral covenants, and then there are unilateral covenants. A bilateral covenant is where I sit down with you and I say, well, you want to rent this room in my house? Yes. How much is it? Well, it's so-and-so. Well, I can't pay that much. Can you come down? Can you do this? What privileges will I have, and so forth? And we sit down and we negotiate this thing, don't we? And this is called a bilateral agreement, or a bilateral covenant. When two people, or more for that matter, get together and they negotiate and they work out something that's agreeable and everybody signs it. That's a bilateral thing. Hey, folks, the covenant that God made was not a bilateral covenant. It was a unilateral covenant. That is, for example, if in the old ancient days, if a king came in and conquered another nation, he would tell this nation, here are the things you got to do. If you will do these things, then we will not destroy you. If you don't do them, we will destroy you. Now, that conquering king has the right to lay down all of the stipulations of his conquest here. So God had the right. He's the creator. He says, the whole world is mine. He's the creator of everything. So he says, I have this right. Now, here's the thing. There's a preamble that identifies him. I am the Lord your God. There is then a historical prologue and I'm the Lord your God. I brought you out of the land of bondage. There's a historical background here. So if we were thinking of it in secular terms, here is a conquering king, and he's offering a covenant to the people who have been conquered. I am King so-and-so, and I have conquered your nation. Here's a historical background to this thing, and the Ten Commandments have a historical background. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of bondage. Okay, here's what I expect of you. The Ten Commandments. Here's what it is. The people of Israel have said, whatever the Lord says, we will do. Now, if you notice in what I read a moment ago, he says, if you will agree to this, my covenant, he says, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. So they had something that God was offering to them. You will be my treasured possession, although I own the whole world, he says. You will be to me a kingdom of priests. You will be a holy nation for me. These are the words that Moses was to take to the people. Now, do you see the benefit then? You have the prologue, you have the historical background, you have the stipulations, the conditions, and then here are the blessings that will come to you. Now, the only thing left is, how will the people respond to this? And like I read just a moment ago, the people responded by saying, yes, we will keep the commandments. We will keep the covenant that God has given us. Now, let me pause right here for just a minute, because I think there's something that's really important that we need to stop and think about. Disobedience to the commandments of God in a covenant relationship, and that's what we have with God as Christians. We have a covenant relationship. Disobedience to the commands of God is a breaking of the covenant. It's not just doing something wrong, folks. It's the breaking of the covenant. We have broken the covenant relationship. Now, let me make a comparison here. The covenant of marriage. In the covenant of marriage, husband and wife promise that they will be faithful to each other. Now, infidelity is not just a sexual act. Infidelity is also an act of the mind and the spirit. When a person is unfaithful to his marriage promise, he is breaking the marriage covenant. When we are unfaithful, when we sin against God, it isn't just a matter of, I made a mistake. It isn't a matter of that at all. It's a breaking of the covenant. And this is the thing that Israel just never did learn. Well, what followed this? He says, I am the Lord your God. You have seen what I did in delivering you and what I did to Egypt. Obey me fully, and I will give you these blessings. And Israel's response was, we will do everything that the Lord said. When you became a Christian, what did you do? You made a promise to God. You made a promise to God of your fidelity. You made a promise to God of your devotion. You made a promise to God of your obedience to Him. Don't break that covenant. Because when I'm unfaithful to Him, it isn't just a matter of sort of a trite thing. It's a very, very serious thing. I am breaking the covenant that I have with God. And so he begins this by saying, here are the commandments that I'm going to give you. Well, there are, the Ten Commandments are divided into two sections. Not just in the things you see, the tablets of stone. But the first four commandments deal with the God-man relationship. The rest of the commandments, the second group of 6, deal with the man-man or the human relationships. Let's take a look at some of these and see what it has to, what they have to say to us. The first commandment. Well, we think sometimes the first commandment doesn't really apply to me because I'm not going to worship a whole bunch of other gods anyway. Well, let's see if we do. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Our problem today is not theological atheism. It is not theological idolatry. It's practical idolatry. Martin Luther had a statement, I understand, that I really like. He said, whatever your heart clings to and relies on, that in truth is your God. That's your God. Job, family, money, prestige, power, entertainment, all of these things at some time or another come in and usurp God's place. It's more important for me to do this than it is for me to be faithful to God. No, I can't afford to do that. This is practical idolatry for us, as I'm trying to emphasize it here. Paul says, avoid covetousness. You know what covetousness is? I was taught all my life that covetous means that you want something somebody else has to the point that you would do something bad to get it. Yeah, that's covetousness, all right. But you know what the simple meaning of the word really is? Selfish. Greed. That's what the word really means. So, when Paul says that avoid covetousness, which is idolatry, what is he talking about? He's talking about practical idolatry. He's not talking about bowing down at some idol somewhere. He's not talking about believing in some other god. He's talking about instead allowing your greed to control you, allowing your selfishness to control you. And it's so practical, and yet we dismiss this thing as if it doesn't really make any difference. Well, I'm not an idolater. I do not worship many gods, and so the first commandment doesn't really apply to me. Well, yes, it does. Because the first thing you know, you and I are finding ourselves falling into the trap of allowing something else or someone else or some ambition to be uppermost in our minds, uppermost in our lives. And so that is the thing that starts guiding me. It may be my ambition. It may be my job. It may be prestige. It may be entertainment. It may be just a lot of stuff that gets in the way, you know, that just takes me away from God. Violation of a sacred covenant. That's what that is. And so what is it when he says, you shall not worship any other God? Thou shalt have no other God before me. Don't bow down to them. Don't serve them. And then the next commandment is, don't have any graven images. Well, these two things went together for a lot of the heathen people. There's an interesting thing about how the Israelites, when they got into the land of Canaan, how they were influenced. You know, all my life I've read the book of Judges, for example, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings in particular, about how the Israelites left God and went into idolatry. I could never understand that until I began looking at the background of the thing. There's something that I've referred to you a number of times before called cultural borrowing. When two countries, for example, are side by side, they're adjacent to each other, the interchange that they have causes one country to adopt some of the customs of the other country. Now, we don't think in terms of that quite so much today, although we ought to. But, the religious practices of one country became the religious practices of their next door neighbors. Well, now here's the thing. How many gods do you have? Well, I've just got one. Oh boy, we got a whole pantheon of gods over here. You can only pray to one God. We can pray to 5 gods. And those gods control all kinds of things. If crops are doing poorly, we can pray to this God. If other things are doing poorly, we pray to this God. And he takes care of all these things. You just got one God? No. Now, the second thing was, let me give you just a story here, a mythological story that was true of the people in Canaan. There was a goddess by the name of Anat, A-N-A-T, Anat. Anat was the sister and or the wife of Baal. Now, you've heard of Baal, haven't you? Okay. Now, every autumn, the fall, the rain stopped, and the foliage died. After the harvest and all this sort of thing, the foliage died. And the theory, the myth among the Canaanites was that Mot, the god of death, had killed Baal, who is the god of rain. That's the reason the rain stopped. It's because Baal got killed by Mot, the god of death. Well, then Anat, the wife of Baal, went out looking for Mot. And she found she went out looking for Baal. She found Baal. Baal was dead. She raised Baal from the dead. And Baal and Anat were back together again. And guess what? This happened just about the springtime. The rains came. That way they knew that Baal had been raised from the dead, you see. So what did they do? Now here's an important thing. They mated, they had sexual relationships, and they celebrated this, and they raised all of the fertility of all of the ground. Now, stop and think about this. Immorality was a part of Canaanite worship. Can you see how appealing that would be to a nation that believed that illicit sex was sinful? And you had such statements in the 10 Commandments that don't commit adultery. And there's a whole, in the 16th chapter of Leviticus, there's a whole litany of things that are not to be done in reference to these relationships. Now, I'm a Canaanite, and you're a Hebrew. And I say to you, you see the liberty that I have with my gods? I can have all of this. I can do all of this. I can partake in all of these different perversions of these sexual things. You can't do any of that, can you? No. Don't you think it'd be fun? Don't you think it'd be good? Don't you think it'd be nice to be able to do that? Yeah. My God won't let me do that. My God, not only does my God allow it, my God encourages it. Now, do you see the thrust of this commandment? Now, what is the practical aspect of that? The practical aspect of it is that today in our own nation, illicit sex is upheld. Illicit sex is promoted in the entertainment industry, in the radio and TV programs that we see. In reference to our own government, although did you notice that in the sex scandals that have come up, not one single commentator that I have heard, and I've listened to a good many of them, not a single one of them said anything about this is immoral. No, they said, oh, this is This is terrible against women. This is terrible publicity. He ought not to do this. This is bad. He's unfaithful to his wife, and so forth and so forth. None of them have said that I know this is wrong in the sight of God. So our nation is falling into the same kind of a trap that these people found themselves in. And so he says, don't worship these gods. Don't have any of those gods before you. And then his next commandment is, don't create any images. Now, I'm not going to say much about that. That just kind of goes along with this whole idea. When people begin thinking in terms of God kind of in a physical sense, like, well, where you've got these gods fighting each other, where you have these gods that are in competition with each other and actually killing one of the gods, and another goddess comes and raises that god up and so forth. When you begin thinking in those terms, people begin thinking in terms of images. This represents my God. And the trouble is, before very long, that image itself becomes a holy object. And we see this all around us, a holy object. God says, don't make any image. Don't make any representation of God. Why? Well, there are two real good reasons. One is we have no idea what it looks like. I don't know how in the world you're going to draw a picture of a spirit. And the second thing is, this lends itself to a different concept of God that the Bible never upholds. And that concept of God is that he has a representation in some kind of image. Well, the Egyptians had all kinds of images. I wrote down a few of them here. Cows and bulls and calves. Humans who had bodies of a human being, but their heads were birds and animals. Snakes, crocodiles, and beetles. Sheep, lions, cats, and dogs. Birds, warriors, combinations of birds, humans, and animals. All kinds of things like this that they had. Well, when we start thinking about God in reference to things like that, our whole concept of God becomes very, very different, very, very wrong. So these two commandments turn out to be very, very important to us in our own particular situation, because we don't realize it sometimes, but our country, our families, our entertainment, our industries are promoting the very things that these two commandments are telling us to avoid. Next week we're going to take some of the other commandments and look at the background of some of those. If you're not a Christian tonight, you have an opportunity to become a child of God. We're going to sing an invitation song, and you're invited to respond at this time. Let's stand together, please.